As you know, the Meat Eater Live Tour is on April 23rd through May 5th. Chances are in a town near you. What you may not know is you can win tickets to each of these events just by going to a backcountry hunters and anglers pint night. There's going to be a pint night in each of these towns: San Diego, Salt Lake City, Tempe, Anaheim, Boise, Sacramento, Missoula, Portland, Tacoma, where you can compete in Meat Eater trivia and win not only tickets to the show, but a chance to be on stage with all of us. So get your butt to a pint night, and we'll see you on stage.
You're listening to the Sportsman's Nation Podcast Network, brought to you by Onyx Hunt and Onyx Maps. Now, I got to have a little heart-to-heart with you here real quick. I used Onyx Maps on my phone every single day during the hunting season, whether I was out west during my elk hunt, South Dakota mule deer hunt, or my rut vacation in Iowa. I was on my phone using Onyx Maps every part of the day, whether I was looking at terrain features on the topographic and satellite maps that they offer on their app, or if I was leaving a waypoint like a watering hole, or where I left my trail cameras or tree stands, or if I was marking a route from a campsite to a glassing position, or from my truck to a tree stand location. I used Onyx Maps every single day, and I feel like it's an app that made my life a little bit easier. I don't know about you, but there's been times in the past where I have been trying to find a tree stand based off of memory and not off of looking at a map. And I have gotten lost in the dark before. I had to wait till sunup and then find it that way. But that problem does not exist anymore because of Onyx, and there's a ton of other features that I think you guys need to check out. Go to onyxmaps.com and check out all the functionality of the app. Download it to your phone, give it a try, and when you do decide to purchase, enter the discount code NATION20, NATION20, and for new users, you're going to receive 20% off. So, onyxmaps.com.
My name is Clay Newcomb, and I'm the host of the Bear Hunting Magazine podcast. I'll also be your host into the world of hunting the icon of North American wilderness, the bear. We'll talk about tactics, gear, conservation, but we'll also bring you into some of the wildest country on the planet, chasing bear. I have always been fascinated by snakes. Snakes are one of those critters that give the wildness to wild places. On this podcast, we sit down with Dr. Chris Jenkins. Chris is a venomous snake expert, and we have an absolutely fascinating conversation. He answered a ton of questions that I've had my whole life about venomous snakes. This, to me, is one of the most information-rich podcasts that we've done that really every outdoorsman and woodsman ought to listen to. To me, we ought to, as woodsmen, we ought to be understanding more than just the animal that we're after, but we ought to be understanding the ecosystem, the environment, and that in most places includes snakes. So this is a super cool podcast with Dr. Chris Jenkins. We are continuing on with our giveaway of what we've been doing, which is if you leave a review of our podcast on iTunes and send us a screen clip of the review, we will consider your entry, consider that an entry for getting either a Northwoods Bear Products bottle of scent, or this week what it is our partners at W Hunting Supply are giving away a t-shirt and a gift card. T-shirt and a gift card to one person that leaves us a review, gets a screen capture, and then communicates that back to us through Instagram private message, Facebook private message, or an email at info@bear-hunting.com. If you've already done it, thanks a ton. We got a lot of good feedback or got a lot of good reviews on the podcast. We really appreciate that. And you are also in the running still. So this week it's from our buddies at W Hunting Supply. Also want to give a shout out to our buddies at the Western Bear Foundation. They're a non-profit bear hunting conservation organization out west. Check out those guys. They're doing a ton of great stuff out west. On now to the podcast about venomous snakes with my buddy, Dr. Chris Jenkins. Well, we are in Hartford, Tennessee, which is an hour and 45 minutes from where my guest, Chris Jenkins, lives. We're at a pretty nice gas station here, I'd say.
Yeah, it's a good spot to get a little breakfast, get a biscuit, and a coffee, and in the beautiful mountains. So.
Yeah, man, it is a dreary, foggy day. This is why they call these the Smoky Mountains, I guess, is because the fog is incredible here. It really is. Yeah. I guess the steepness of the mountains and the humidity, I don't know, something about these mountains really is pretty unique for fog.
Yeah, no, I agree. They call it smoky for a reason. So
yeah. Well, thanks a ton for coming over here. Chris, give me a general introduction. And we said before we met 15 minutes ago. And now I knew about you through backcountry hunters and anglers and just stuff that I'd seen online. But what's cool about this podcast is I've got a ton of questions for you about who you are and what you do. And one of the main things we're going to talk about, and we'll probably talk about other things, but is about venomous snakes. So that's what this podcast, if you've clicked on this podcast and you get the EBGBs from venomous snakes, keep listening. Don't turn it off. But no, so give me even a personal introduction, where you're from and kind of what you're doing these days.
Well, I'll start off by telling you where I'm at and then, how I got there. So, first of all, I walk a very fine line in my life. My greatest loves in this world, outside of my personal life and my family, are snakes, in particular venomous snakes, and hunting and fishing. And oftentimes, the hunting and fishing community is not the greatest fan of snakes, and oftentimes snake fans are not the greatest fans of hunting and fishing. That's a broad generalization, but I walk that fine line between the two, and so that's pretty interesting. So currently, I am I'm the chief executive officer of the Orianne Society, which is a nonprofit, and we focus on basically research and conservation of rare reptiles and amphibians all around the world. But my personal specialty would be venomous snakes and rattlesnakes. I also serve as the chair of the Viper Specialist Group for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which administers the red list. For example, there would be a bear specialist group. There's a kind of a specialist group, for every group of animals. So I created and chair the Viper Specialist Group, where I work with and coordinate hundreds of people in countries all around the world doing viper conservation biology. And I'm also the founding chairman of the soon-to-be Georgia chapter of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. So I've got kind of I've taken a long circuitous route, as most of us have through life. But in my career, first of all, I grew up in New England and spent a lot of time there. I kind of grew up as in the outdoors. I grew up in a very rural part of New England. And
what state up there?
I grew up in Massachusetts, kind of right on the Massachusetts-Vermont border, right in that area. Okay. And I ended up, as a child, I was real into the outdoors. I was, I would hunt and fish and hike and spend a lot of time in the woods. And, I actually had quite a fear of snakes when I was a young child. A lot of people in my line of work have the opposite story. They were always out hunting down these animals, trying to find the snakes, trying to find the frogs. I actually had quite a fear of them. And
were there venomous snakes up there in Massachusetts?
There are venomous snakes in Massachusetts, but there's only a handful of populations left. They're actually they're an endangered species in the state.
What have they got up there?
timber rattlesnakes.
Okay.
And they're copperheads in parts of the region as well.
Okay.
Most New England states, New Hampshire's down to 1 population, Vermont's down to really 2. They're extinct in Maine. There's maybe 5 or 6 in each of Massachusetts and Connecticut. So they're one of the
5 or 6 individual animals?
I'm sorry, populations.
Got it.
New Hampshire did get to a point where you could count the number of snakes in the state, real low numbers. They're working on turning that around. But but anyway, so I grew up there, and I ended up going to do my undergraduate degree at the University of Massachusetts in the wildlife biology department. Okay. And I am a bear fanatic. I wanted to be a bear biologist. That was my goal in wildlife school. And I ended up having my first summer internship was out in California in the Sierra Nevadas. And it just happened to be on turtles and frogs. And so I went out and I did the job, and it was a great experience. I saw my first rattlesnake in the wild up in the Sierras at a place called Shaver Lake. And it was interesting. When I got back to New England, I just found I was going out in the woods. I was still interested in bears and tracking deer and all of that, but I found myself continually going to wetlands, looking for frogs, looking for snakes. So it just changed this perspective. And I really, and I knew I had this fear of snakes. I realized it was actually this really intense fascination. And so I was...
You redefined that, what maybe your mother would have called fear.
Exactly. And everybody has it. When I talk about snakes to people, I always say nobody's indifferent to a snake. You don't just walk by and be like, there's a squirrel. It's extreme, fear. It's extreme excitement. It's an extreme emotion.
Yes.
Yeah. So I took, that extreme and realized it was actually fascination. And I forced myself to explore that. So I bought a snake as a pet, and I started spending time going out and looking for them, and searching out people who were working on them and going out with them. So going on from there, I did my master's in wildlife conservation also at University of Massachusetts. And I didn't quite get to the point of working with snakes, but I did my master's research on salamanders up in New England, and just kind of continued that growth. And then from there, I went out to Idaho, and I lived in Idaho for about 10 years. I did my PhD on Great Basin rattlesnakes, real close to Yellowstone, kind of in southeast Idaho, just southwest of Yellowstone National Park. And, I spent my entire time out there working on the ecology of rattlesnakes, and just dove in, feet first. And basically, after those experiences that I had in California that introduced me to reptiles and amphibians, career-wise, I have not looked back. I've continued my interest in hunting and fishing in the outdoors through that whole time, but it was really on the personal side. It was more recently that I kind of got into the conservation world within the hunting and fishing space. So,
man, that's fascinating. So you have a doctorate in what?
I have a doctorate in biological sciences.
Okay.
So
I guess the fascinating thing, and I would know very little about it, but reptiles would be an indicator species. Is that right? I mean, in most cases, an indicator species meaning they indicate their health indicates a whole lot of stuff being in check or out of check in the ecosystem structure above them. Is that a good way to describe it?
Yeah, I would say many reptile species and many amphibian species as well in particular would be indicators of different types of things in the environment. A lot of animals that respond really quickly to change are good indicators because their populations would change very quickly and don't respond well.
Why would a salamander be that?
So salamanders are, first of all, their skin. Many of the salamanders here in these mountains First of all, I should say we are sitting in the biodiversity hotspot in the world for salamanders.
Is that right?
The Southern Appalachians are the hotspot. More species of salamanders here than anywhere. But salamanders.
My next question after you answer the first question is why is that? So go ahead and answer the first question, then we'll go back to the why.
So salamanders, as well as other amphibians, they have a different type of skin than we do. It's very porous. And that's why you think of frogs and salamanders and things like that needing to stay wet. And that's because their skin does need to stay wet. And there are some species, many of which live in these mountains right here, that don't even have lungs. They actually breathe through their skin, and their skin needs to be wet to facilitate that. And so because of that, their skin is very porous and absorbs a lot of, it just has the ability to absorb.
So any change in any environmental change is going to dramatically affect their life cycle.
Certainly. And we have a global amphibian crisis right now where hundreds of species in recent years have gone extinct. There are diseases, a couple kind of premier diseases, but there are diseases that are hitting these amphibians that are just causing waves of declines. I mean, we being the greater group of herpetologists in the world have followed the decline of Central American amphibians, for example. It moved like a wave through Central America, and a lot of the snakes that fed on the salamanders declined behind them. So they are great indicators. I will say there are other reptiles that serve kind of interesting other ecological roles, like keystone species or umbrella type species. We could get into those terms. Yeah. But your second question was, why?
Why are the Southern Appalachians a hotspot for salamanders?
Yeah. So the Southern Appalachians are, they're a wonderful place. I feel like I've lived here about 10 years, and I've lived in different parts of the country, again, New England, the Rockies. I've traveled the world. But, I feel like I moved home. I love it.
It's hard not to feel like you've moved home when you come here.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
I don't know why. My wife actually said when I was coming over here to see Mr. Roy, she said, I can't remember how she said it. She's been over here. She said, I feel like you're going home. She actually said that. Maybe it's a common theme here. I don't know.
No, it's great. The people are great.
Maybe it's the Dolly Parton signs on the interstate. They're like, welcome to Tennessee.
It's just a great part of the world. The people are great and friendly. There's a deep culture and heritage that's remained largely, and you're surrounded by public land and wildlife. It's just a wonderful place. Yes. So in terms of salamanders, this is an interesting area because as you think about how our country was glaciated over time, this was a real refugia, and so like
what does that mean?
It was a refuge. It was a place that wasn't glaciated, and places to the north, not so far north, were. So
were there parts on the East Coast that were glaciated?
Yeah, certainly north of here. Like if you go up to, some good bear hunting country, say like the mountains in Maine or New Hampshire, right? And you go out in the mountains, they have a distinctly different feel. In that, if I'm sure you've been there.
These mountains are very karst, maybe very steep. Even for being an older range, they're pretty not sharp, but you just go straight up and straight
up and down. You go up to Maine, you're going to find these giant like boulder fields and huge swamp wetlands. All of those landscape features were created by ice that came through and tore up that landscape. We didn't have that. That's why our mountains here have just eroded over time, and that's why you don't see those types of features. There's rock exposed, but you don't see those giant talus fields that you see in the Northeast. So anyways, as a refugia, it's also a very complex place. There's a lot of slope, as you mentioned, and there's a lot of different aspects or the way the mountains face, north, south, east, west. And so what that results in is all these interesting little, we'd call them niches or little places that animals could go to and in a very small area find something that they need. Maybe it's dark and cold and wet.
That might be like the north side of a mountain, and there's because the irregularness of a eroded mountain landscape, there's just tons of north-facing slopes or east-facing slopes, or
exactly. And then you combine that with all the water. And so our stream systems, again, we don't have the big wetlands, but our stream systems are complex, going all the way from high elevation seeps all the way down to big rivers. So you have you had a high diversity of niches, as I described, and you had all these animals that were pushed into this area. And the thought is that they went into these places, and because of that, you had the development of a lot of species that over time during that period evolved in a particular niche. And what we're living in today with the salamanders and many other animals is kind of the remnants of that.
Wow, that makes total sense. So to jump to venomous snakes. First of all, you corrected me before the podcast because I said poisonous snakes. Tell us why that's wrong.
Yeah. So the first thing I'd say in general with snakes is that so much of what you hear or learn through family, friends, media are myths or exaggerations. And so if somebody saw one garter snake in their backyard, they saw 100 diamondback rattlesnakes that were chasing them through the yard.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I'm exaggerating there, but that's what happens. And so the size of snakes get exaggerated, for example, the numbers of snakes. But so this is one of those things, I wouldn't call it a myth. It's just, it's not, I personally, it doesn't bother me, but a lot of people.
It's an improper word usage.
Yeah, so if something is poisonous, there are many, we were talking about salamanders, there are poisonous salamanders, for example, where if something else ingested them, if you were to eat a poisonous salamander, or if a predator was to eat it, that would be a poison, and versus a venom is something that envenomates you, something that delivers it into you. And so our venomous snakes have mechanisms for injecting very complex venom cocktails, if you will, that can make us sick in different ways.
So a mushroom would be poisonous if you ate it and got sick.
Yes, sir.
A rattlesnake is venomous when he injects venom into you. Yeah,
exactly.
that makes sense. That makes sense.
Exactly.
Well, tell me about the organization that you work for. And I ultimately want to get to talking about timber rattlesnakes, copperheads, and kind of, I'm an old snake man.
Yeah.
Okay. I really am. I've been fascinated with snakes my whole life. And I was an early adapter because of my father, who was an early adapter of guys that didn't kill snakes.
Yeah.
I mean, you grew in these mountains and the mountains of the Ozarks and Ouachitas in Arkansas. I mean, people killed snakes. That's what they did. You know what I mean?
All around the world. Yeah, you were probably an outcast because.
Well, but it was my dad who no one taught him that. He just was out in the woods enough that he, early on he killed rattlesnakes and stuff, and he got to a point where he was like, that snake's not trying to hurt me, and he valued it.
Yeah.
And he passed that on to us, and I actually got to where I don't do it anymore. I like to catch them and release them, just with my hands.
Yeah.
And but anyway, so that's where I want to get to that. But tell me about the organization that you're.
Well, I'd love to get to all that, and I'll tell you some of my philosophies. And I think a lot of people would be might be a little surprised that that I'm not real extreme on that. But I have some interesting thoughts on that I'll talk about. But to start off, I'll start with the Orianne Society, and I'll briefly just tell you the origins. So I was, after I finished my PhD at Idaho State, I was working for Wildlife Conservation Society, which is best known as the Bronx Zoo. The Bronx Zoo is the headquarters, but they have hundreds of conservation biologists all over the world. And I was working in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem on rattlesnakes and sage grouse and a whole variety of wildlife. And I got contacted by a gentleman from New York City, a gentleman named Dr. Kaplan, who was our founding chairman of our board. And we founded the organization together. And he happened to be down in Florida with his daughter, Orianne. And she had the opportunity to kind of have a behind the scenes look at this zoo. and they put an eastern indigo snake, which we could talk about, but I'll just say that they're one of the most amazing snakes we have here in North America, our largest native snake, a snake-eating snake.
Eastern indigo.
Yeah, fascinating animals.
Okay.
And so she had the opportunity to hold one of those. Her father, Dr. Kaplan, he happened to be one of the biggest philanthropists in the world for rare cats, things like tigers and lions. And he has another organization that works to save those. And she asked her father, she said, she's holding this snake. And she said, Dad, can I have one of these? Like as a pet? And
this is a little girl?
Little girl, young girl.
Yeah.
Probably the time, I don't remember exact age. Let's just say she was in the ballpark of 7 years old, somewhere give or take. And he said, he knows a lot about indigo snakes, very, very knowledgeable. And he said, sweetie, you can't. That's an endangered species. And it is it's a threatened species on our federal endangered species list. He said, you can't. That's a snake that's declining. It's an endangered species. And she turned to her father and she said, Dad, will you do for indigo snakes what you're doing for tigers? And so, anyways, he was working through WCS on some of the cat projects. And so he tracked me down as a snake ecologist at WCS, and the rest is history. We created this organization. We were originally founded to work primarily in the southeastern coastal plain, and on this snake and some of the animals it depends on. For example, gopher tortoises. It's a tortoise that is a great example of one of these keystone species I mentioned. Okay. We can talk about what that means.
This snake eats tortoises?
Well, the snake will eat some baby tortoises, but it depends on the tortoise because the tortoise digs a hole. And that hole is used by over 300 other species that we in science have documented.
Is that right?
Game species too, bobwhite quail, all kinds of other reptiles, amphibians, mammals, birds. So it's a critically important animal.
Wow.
So you're probably getting the keystone
for digging
concept.
holes.
For digging holes, yeah. The keystone concept is you pull the keystone out of a door, it all collapses. So you pull the gopher tortoise out, all those other animals that use that hole have a problem.
Oh, wow.
But so anyways, we were founded to work down in that area, and we built the organization to really do what we call science-fueled boots-on-the-ground conservation. What that means is we don't do lobbying, we don't do litigation, we don't do advocacy. We do science, and we do things on the ground, tangible things to make a difference. So we buy land, we do conservation easements on land, we do a lot of habitat restoration work, we do reintroductions of rare reptiles. So we have breeding facilities where we breed them and then release them into the wild to restore populations. We do a lot of inventory monitoring, so real hands-on, tangible type approaches. And then I'll wrap the Orianne piece up just by saying over the last, say, 6-7 years, we've been in existence about 11 years now. Over the last 6 or 7 years, we expanded our scope, and we now have 3 large initiatives in North America, one being that southeastern coastal plain. We have one we call Appalachian Highlands, which is focused on the landscape we're sitting in. It's focused on species like salamanders, timber rattlesnakes, some of the rare turtles. And we have a program called Great Northern Forests, which we have is based out of Vermont, but works across that kind of transition between the northern hardwood forests and the boreal, transition area. We work on a lot of rare freshwater turtles up there. Wow. So we've expanded over time. We do have, and have had small projects throughout the western United States, all over the world, and other countries. So, but we've kind of followed that same model of how we develop that.
That's incredible.
That boots on the ground approach.
Tell me about this snake. What's the name of this snake?
It's an eastern indigo snake.
Now, see, I've heard of it through you on your social media, but I would not have known that snake was down here. Where does that snake live? How big does it get?
So the first thing I'd say is every animal has a Latin name, and its Latin name is Drymarchon cooperi. And Drymarchon loosely translates into emperor of the forest or king of the forest, and it truly is. This is a giant predatory snake. I like to think of it as like the tiger of the southeastern coastal plain. So they live in the...
It's not venomous?
It is not venomous.
Okay.
It is immune to the venom of the venomous snakes that live in its range because it eats a lot of them.
Oh, wow. It's like a superhero.
Yeah, there you go. To a lot of people, yeah, it would be. It's a fascinating animal. So it lives in the southeastern coastal plain. Historically, the western edge of its range would have kind of been just into southern Mississippi. And then it comes through...
So all the way through there.
Yeah, and they're no longer in Mississippi. But and then it comes... The historic range comes all the way east through southern Alabama, panhandle of Florida, and then it comes up into southeast Georgia. And its historic range, we think, kind of ended at about the Savannah River. So there was some debate about whether it was ever in South Carolina. But it's a lowland species, oftentimes associated with the longleaf pine ecosystem, but it occurs in all types of ecosystems, especially as you get into Florida.
How big does it get?
So the record, and this was an animal that came from the vicinity of the Everglades, extreme South Florida. The record length is right about 8.5 feet. So, and most people are like 8.5 feet. That's not that big of a snake.
Oh, that's a big snake.
That's a big snake. That's the
Would
long.
it be as big around as a average man's forearm? Or something?
A really big male could be be about that size.
Yeah,
and they're highly predatory. And because of that, just like any big predator in nature, they have a giant home range. They have the largest documented home range of any native snake in North America. The pythons, of course, have a bigger range. But, so these animals, an individual animal in a year is covering thousands and thousands of acres potentially. And they're, they're moving across these coastal plain landscapes and looking for prey. That's why we call them.
What are they eating?
They're eating... Well, they're a generalist, so they kind of eat anything.
Anything that moves that they can fit in their mouth.
Yeah, but about 50% of their diet is other snakes. So we could get into the evolution of snake skulls, and people don't want to hear me talk about that, so we won't. But I will tell you there's two extremes, and a rattlesnake and an indigo represent those two extremes. You have certain snakes that actually, a rattlesnake is like this, has a really light skull. There's not a lot of bone. They're real fragile skulls, a lot of soft tissue, and they can open their mouths really, really wide and swallow big things.
I see.
And then you have other animals like indigo snakes. King snakes would be another one. You've probably seen king snakes. That they have a really rigid skull, a lot of muscle, a lot of bone, really powerful, but they can't open their mouths that wide.
Okay.
And so those snakes over time have evolved that they typically eat more narrow things, like a lot of lizards, a lot of snakes. So indigo snakes are one of them.
That's why you hear king snakes eat other snakes.
Yep, they do. They're very similar to indigos in that regard.
Wow. So I didn't mean to interrupt your train of thought there. So this thing is a snake eater.
It's a snake-eating snake. About 50% of its diet would be other snakes. And then, everything else there, they eat lizards. They eat they'll eat birds, they'll eat small mammals, they'll eat baby tortoises.
And they're immune to rattlesnake, copperhead, water moccasin venom.
Yes, sir. So we watched one eat an eastern diamondback rattlesnake once, and the indigo snake grabbed this diamondback mid-body.
Okay.
The diamondback immediately swung around and sunk its fangs into the indigo snake. And then the diamondback released, and the indigo snake proceeded to walk its mouth up the body of the diamondback till it got to the head. And then it crushed the head with its powerful jaw, and then it just swallowed the diamondback whole.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing.
So why are these snakes in jeopardy? Just is it habitat degradation? Is it people been killing them for 200 years?
I'm sure some people have killed them, but they're an interesting snake, kind of like king snakes, in that in general, the public recognizes them as a good snake. You'll hear a lot
kind
of
of like
people.
kind of like a king snake.
Yeah, so people would be less apt to kill them. What really is driving it is probably two things. One, the decline of the gopher tortoise, that hole they need in much of their range. They need that hole to survive the winter. And they're really a tropical snake. Their relatives go all the way down into South America. They're kind of like, they got stuck in Southeast North America as it cooled down. And so they need those tortoise burrows to survive the winter. So the decline of the tortoise.
What about armadillo holes, man? Armadillos moved in. That won't work for them.
Maybe in some places, but they're not deep. And these tortoise burrows go 20, 30 feet
is that
deep.
right?
Temperatures are very... it's basically the same temperature as the deep soil down there year round. So in the summer, it'd be cooler than the air, and then in the winter, it'd be much warmer than the air. So anyways, in the winter, they need those. So that's part of it. The other part is linked to this, them being the emperor of the forest, being the tiger of our coastal plains, in that they to live out their life, they need to hunt and travel vast landscapes. In our southeastern coastal plain, I encourage you to go on Google Maps or Google Earth and just start picking random places in the coastal plain. I mean, it's like the Great Plains. It's one of the most fragmented, converted landscapes out there. So these snakes are crossing roads frequently.
Okay. Yeah.
And
it seems to be a theme inside of a lot of what's happening probably worldwide, but specifically in North America, is fragmentation. So for everything, for bears, for all kind of stuff, when you have man-made fragmentation of large habitats, that's problems. I mean, like for bears in Arkansas, it would be Interstate 40 dividing the Ouachita's and the Ozarks. Well, these two populations have now pretty much become allopatric. Am I using the right word? Like separate populations.
Sure, yeah.
And before that highway was there, they were interbreeding, which would have been better for them. But so what you're saying is that just the intrusion of man, building roads, clearing pasture, draining swamps to make cattle pastures or fields is hurting them. Yeah.
So perhaps more than any snake in the southeastern coastal plain, they need big, wild landscapes, and those are at a premium now in the southeast. So
that's incredible. See, I didn't even know about that snake. So the venomous snakes that we would have in the southeast, can I try to name them?
Okay,
there's not that many.
Depends where you are, what you define as the southeast.
Okay, and I guess I would categorize I don't know all.
Why don't we go with Arkansas? How about that?
Well, okay, I know the ones in Arkansas. Okay, because I've had the poster on my wall since I was 11.
So you get this one right.
No, the timber rattlesnake, copperhead, water moccasin, coral snake.
The western coral snake, the Texas coral snake. And then there are parts of Arkansas that would overlap the western diamondback, which I've never seen one, but they claim part of the little circle comes into western Arkansas. That would be it, wouldn't it? Pygmy
rattlesnake. Yes,
which a lot of people confuse for being baby timber rattlesnakes,
right?
Because a full-grown pygmy rattlesnake is actually a very small snake, maybe a foot and a half, potentially, maybe a little bigger. But
I've never seen a coral snake, but I have seen multiple. Is it false coral snakes? The ones that have the backwards color, red touch yellow, kill a fellow.
Yeah, so there are. It depends where you are, but there are multiple species in the southeast that could potentially be confused with a coral snake. Another thing I just wanted to back up, relate the coral snake to the indigo. Coral snakes are also snakes that eat other snakes and lizards.
Okay.
But coral snakes are interesting in that the bulk of their diversity, most coral snake species are in kind of Central and South America. And you can go really throughout their range, and most places that you'll find a coral snake, you will find another snake that is non-venomous that has a similar looking pattern. And so
how does that happen?
In ecology, we call that mimicry, and there's a lot of debate about mimicry and coral snakes, and I don't want to get into that, but I will say the thought is that over long periods of time, so a coral snake is a highly venomous animal.
Yeah.
And so if you look like a very venomous animal, and over long periods of time, predators learn that that's what something dangerous looks like, in theory, even though you're not venomous, those predators would avoid you as well. That's a gross simplification.
Would that be basically just almost by chance over eons that a non-venomous snake would evolve an adaptation of color that resembled that already solidified snake, and then he was passed over, so that snake bred, and then the next so two snakes that kind of looked like that snake bred and had offspring, and then of all their offspring, the ones that looked more like the coral snake were selected by nature to survive and breed. Yep. Am I on the right track?
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing essentially is natural selection. Right. And natural selection is not much different, really, than, you here in this area, it's famous for plot hounds. It's not much different than the creation of plot hounds. That's, obviously a human selection, but it's the same concept. You're selecting for certain characteristics and you're breeding them into an animal, and the resulting offspring, if it's genetically passed on, have those characteristics. And so it's the same thing with that or other.
So it's just a highly refined evolution. I mean, is that just what we see now looks so intentional? Yeah. I mean, because we, like these little coral snakes that I've seen in Arkansas, I never saw a very big one. Well, I don't even know what they're called. I call them false coral snakes because the colors were reversed. So a coral snake has this red, yellow, and black. Yep. Beautiful. I mean, just an incredible snake. Yep. And so if the colors are certain, you identify a coral snake based upon the pattern of the colors. And
It's fascinating. People have come up with all these rhymes. You mentioned one. So, it's an interesting natural selection process. And I'm not trying to, I just want to state, I'm not trying to offend any of your listeners. You'll hear me talk a lot about evolution and natural selection. And I mean, to me, natural selection is it's fact. It's something that's happened. I'm not making any statement about how life was created or any of that. Yes. But we see, I talked about plot hounds. We know that animals are created by either human processes or natural processes. It happens in nature. Yeah. We've seen it. So I'm not trying to offend anybody.
Hey, you know what? This is a great place, and we don't have to talk about this, but I am a Bible-believing creationist, and I absolutely believe I have no problem looking at natural selection and certain processes inside evolution that just are science that make sense.
They're not mutually exclusive. And I think if you are a Bible-believing Christian, as you mentioned, you don't have to be afraid of natural selection. And if you're someone who believes in natural selection and evolution, you don't have to be afraid of the other side either.
Right.
So.
Right.
Yeah. They
that's a great, that's a great thing to say, because I'm with you. Sometimes saying the E word in some parts of the world, but I've never been afraid of that.
That is not a statement. I'm not saying anything about God or religion. They could, in my mind, they could potentially both exist.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so rattlesnakes.
Rattlesnakes, yeah.
Rattlesnakes.
My favorite. And timber rattlesnakes. Oh, the rattlesnakes are one of my favorite animals on the planet. And timber rattlesnakes are probably my favorite.
Yeah,
rattlesnake, and probably my favorite animal on the planet, to be quite honest with you.
What would the common names that I've heard of timber rattlers in Arkansas would be velvet tail? Is that? Do you hear that?
I don't hear that here, but there's a lot of names and a lot of regionalized names. So timber rattlesnake is a wide-ranging animal. It is truly like America's rattlesnake. It's
America's rattlesnake.
It was on our flags in the American Revolution. People like Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin wanted this animal to be our national symbol. Imagine if there was a timber rattlesnake everywhere instead of a bald eagle. But that's what he wanted. He was also,
Yeah.
you know, people have heard about the turkey as well, but he was a big proponent. There's some great quotes. And the reason is, you know, and we also used it on the flags. You see those flags have been revived lately, you know, the yellow flags with the don't tread on me. That's a timber rattlesnake. And those flags, there are multiple, but those were used back in the times around the American Revolution to symbolize, you know, just that dedication and that independence that we here in the Americas had, and as we fought for our independence from from England. So it is America's snake, and part of that is it's kind of the dominant snake in the eastern United States. It goes all the way historically from Maine down into North Florida, and then it goes west into the kind of northern Midwest. You can find it in states like Minnesota and Wisconsin. It's pretty rare in those places. And then it goes all the way down through Arkansas, Oklahoma, and places like Texas, and its range starts to peter out in there. So it's a very wide-ranging snake. It's the rattlesnake that, you know, probably most Americans encounter when they encounter a rattlesnake, just because of the human populations. And it has a lot of different names. The two big common ones that you hear are timber rattlesnake, obviously, and canebrake rattlesnake.
Canebrake. Okay.
And in my part of the world, meaning more on the Atlantic side, that really comes from the two things: that the snake looks different. It's the same species, but it looks different in different places. And it's a hardwood forest associated snake. So when you're in the mountains like this, it's kind of everywhere. You know, I mean, it lives in this whole landscape because it's a hardwood dominated landscape.
Would you say that it's an eastern deciduous forest in fringe and fringe? So two things: eastern deciduous forest, and then kind of the fringe of that snake. I mean, is that the kind of the biome that it lives in?
Yeah, I mean, that's the dominant.
Maybe that's not a good description.
The dominant part of its range would be in the eastern deciduous forest. But then, like, as it gets west out into, you know, some places, say like Texas, Oklahoma, it is going to be more associated with kind of, you know, your hardwood draws. But the canebrake, say, let's take Georgia, where I live. So you've got the mountains, and you've got that hardwood forest, and the timber rattlesnakes there, they look, first of all, they're smaller than the canebrake, and they come in two color morphs. They're either yellow, and they can be bright yellow, or they're black, and they can be bright black, or they can be somewhere in between. But usually it's pretty easy to characterize them. Oh, that's a yellow morph, or that's a black morph. And then as you get more into the lowlands of the southeast, they start to take on a different look. They're bigger. They're typically kind of like grayish. They might have a little pink hue to them at times. And people call them canebrakes. And as you get down into...
Same species
genetically. And as you get down like into the coastal plain, say of Georgia, if you think about where your hardwoods are, they're more in the bottoms, more where you'd get canebrakes, you'd get switch cane and other things like that.
They named it because that's where they were finding them. That's where they were seeing them.
And don't get me wrong, timber rattlesnakes come up into pine forests and do other things too, but generally you find them more associated with hardwood forests, and that's why in the coastal plain they're more associated with kind of the wet, swampy hardwood areas. Again, it's generalization, but
how big can a timber rattler get?
So I don't remember the record off the top of my head. It certainly would be a coastal plain form, a canebrake form. Here in the mountains, you know, I'd spend a lot of time in the field monitoring their populations, and you know, really a 4-foot rattlesnake would be a really big one. I mean, they can get bigger than that too, but you know, all these stories you hear about, you get it more with diamondbacks, but like, you'll see all these pictures, you know, you get this forced perspective like fishermen do, where somebody's got a snake on a hook and they hold it out 4 feet.
And it looks like an 8-foot snake.
And so like eastern diamondbacks, for example, which are the biggest rattlesnake in the world, western diamondbacks being a close second. Easterns, I can't remember the exact record, but it's somewhere in the ballpark of 7 feet long.
Really?
But you'll see all these social media things, you know, some dead eastern diamondback, and they're talking about a 16, 17-foot snake. Those just, I mean, that would be like seeing a 2,000-pound bear or something. You know,
yeah, it's just not true. Where are the eastern diamondbacks?
So this is another interesting myth with snakes in general. It's because of these common names, like it gets perpetuated that there are all these different snakes in all these different places. So you hear a lot of people say, oh, diamondback rattlesnakes. You hear a lot of people say water moccasins or cottonmouths in places where those snakes don't even occur. And with a diamondback, it could be, for example, a timber rattlesnake that somebody's seeing. With a cottonmouth, there are a lot of cottonmouths. They have a pretty wide range as well. You certainly would have them in Arkansas. Yeah. But there are a lot of places they don't occur. But if anybody, I'm generalizing again, but if a lot of people see a snake in the water, they oftentimes think it's a cottonmouth. Right. And in many places, cottonmouths don't exist. And then even in places like the Southeast, there's a lot of water snake species.
A lot of water snakes.
And and they're actually pretty easy to tell apart. In terms of IDing, I'll get back to your original question with Eastern Diamondbacks, but one thing I tell people, I always get all these questions about identifying venomous snakes. And I do a lot of presentations around the country on snake safety and snake identification. And I've kind of gotten to the point, maybe I'm a little jaded, but I can go through all these details. I can tell you what a rattlesnake's eye looks like. I can tell you what what the particular shape of this, but they're all real fine characteristics. And the rattle's a good one, but not all rattlesnakes have their rattles. We can talk about that too. But I've gotten to the point where, especially when I'm talking to hunting groups now, where I put up a picture of a mule deer and a white-tailed deer. And, I basically say, if you're concerned, like if you're going on a deer hunt and say you only have a whitetail tag, but mule deer and whitetail overlap in that area, you just need to know the difference. And there's, and obviously the antlers are much different, but there's differences in the body size, sometimes color. Like you just know the difference. And when I look at these snakes, they simply look different. And if you're concerned, let's say you're a waterfowl hunter in Arkansas and you're concerned about cottonmouths, just learn what a cottonmouth looks like versus a water snake. And I'm not trying to, it's easy. That's what I'm telling you. It's as easy.
It's not hard.
But the problem is with snake identification, as with many things with snakes, is when many people see a snake, they lose their minds. Their minds literally stop functioning properly.
Yeah.
And if you realize, don't get me wrong, if you step on a snake, you should be concerned and you should immediately try to get away from that. But most people need to realize that most venomous snakes, to get bit by them, you literally need to almost touch them. They don't strike that far. You have to put your hand on them. You have to put your foot on them. You have to put it within 6 inches.
Yeah.
Then you need to be concerned. But if you see a snake 10 feet away, remain calm.
No problem.
Yeah. Don't lose your mind. And you can make very logical decisions like, oh, that looks like a whitetail versus a mule deer or a cottonmouth versus a water snake. So I oftentimes, when I'm talking about snake safety, one of the best things people can do is remain calm, and that helps in identification. And if you can properly identify a snake, that's the first step to safety, because most snakes you encounter will not be venomous.
What do you think about so here's the scenario with killing snakes, and I can say I know for sure a person doesn't need to be killing snakes out in the woods ever. What about a snake that's in your yard? Mm-hmm. Let's say you got a 4-foot timber rattler in your yard. I had a good friend of mine in Arkansas that lives in, I'm not going to say the city he lives in, but a big city in Arkansas, lives in the suburbs. He walked out of his house back in the fall, and there was a monster timber rattler in his driveway. And I mean, he's got a 7-year-old daughter and his wife. Yeah. That snake didn't fare very well.
Yeah. So
what do you think about that?
So I'll tell you the legality of it versus my personal opinion. Yeah. So the legality, the first thing I tell everybody relative to snakes is, like other wildlife, there are laws in each state, and you should just brush up on those if you're concerned. And they vary from like some state like Pennsylvania that has a hunting season for them, and they've actually done it relatively well in terms of how they administer it. to other states where, like Georgia, where they're excluded.
So these snakes aren't
no,
federally protected, like rattlesnakes.
Well, there are some species of rattlesnakes, like Massasaugas and New Mexico ridge-nosed rattlesnakes, which are federally protected. And there would be certain states, certain species in certain states that are state protected. Like, for example, eastern diamondback rattlesnakes in North Carolina would be protected heavily at a state level, or timber rattlesnakes if you go up into some of these northeastern states. So I just know the laws around it. Typically, if it's in your yard in most states, even states where, say killing a rattlesnake would be the equivalent of like shooting a robin with a shotgun. It's a wildlife violation, but it's not some big endangered species
I see.
type violation. Even in those states, typically, I can't speak for anyone, but I would expect that in most states, most wardens wouldn't persecute that type of thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. Some places they might.
Right.
They
could, though. They could.
Some states, depending on the laws.
I'm pretty sure in Arkansas, rattlesnakes are protected.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm not sure the exact laws in Arkansas. In Georgia, they're not.
Right.
They're like a precluded species. So you can do anything you want with as many rattlesnakes as you want. You can wallpaper your house with their skins. Well, we're working on changing some of that. We just want rattlesnakes. I'm not trying to say no rattlesnake should ever die. I'm just trying to say they should be considered wildlife. Like
that's surprising to me.
So
yeah.
But my personal philosophy is, well, first I'll tell you, I live in a very rural part of these mountains, and I have venomous snakes in my yard every year. I have snakes that try to use places on my house as their gestation sites.
This is like a dream for you, though, man.
Yeah. But I have dogs, and I have 2 young kids that love to run around barefoot, and I've had one of my bird dogs, get a copperhead bite to the face, for example. Mm-hmm. And so I'll tell you, I don't want them in my front yard either. Of course, I have the expertise. I can physically
catch them and move them.
Yeah, I move them back into the forest. And in many places, especially as you get into a suburban environment like that, there are groups, whether it be a government group or like wildlife rescues, that provide those types of services that will come and move
catch
an
it for
animal.
you.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would, and that's just a very localized thing that I can't speak to outside of my area, but that's something that could be researched in the places that everybody lives. So I'm not going to tell you what to do or what not to do. I'll tell you to look at the laws. I will tell you that I don't want a snake in my front yard biting my child or my dog. And I can understand, translocation or doing something to deal with that animal within, the confines of the law.
Yeah.
And I'll leave that at that. But I don't have issue with that. What I have issue with is when people go into these beautiful, wild places and they, say they're out in the Ozark National Forest, miles from anyone. They see a rattlesnake and they take it upon themselves to kill this animal.
Right.
And you're going into its home. All you have to do is walk around that animal. You'll never see it again in your life. And I've been called out before because, as you know, I'm an avid hunter. I mean, I hunt a lot. And I've hunted all over the country, other countries. And people call me out on that, but there's a big difference.
Big difference.
We manage our game species using a biological approach that we've set up goals to maintain their populations over long periods of time, whether it's you can only harvest a male of a given species, you have certain season dates, certain places you can hunt them. It's managed very intensively. But with snakes, it's not managed like that. And in my mind, if we go into wild places and kill every venomous snake that we see, but at the same time, we're not taking the biological information we have about those animals and setting up a management plan to do that, then I can't support it. It'd be like if it was open season on bears. Year round, I'm going to go in the woods in these
everyone
mountains.
I see, I'm going to kill.
I'm going to kill everyone I see, and people would be up in arms about it. And so I get up in arms about people who go do that because rattlesnakes, whether you like them or not, are an important component to many ecosystems across North America. And just like any other animal, if you take them out of that equation, there's going to be a lot of impacts, and there's social values and aesthetic values. There's a lot of values to snakes.
Absolutely.
And the true risk posed to people is so minuscule.
Mm-hmm.
So later today, I'm going to get back to my office, and I need to take a couple of rattlesnakes out and clean their cages. So later today, I'm going to be handling a 6-foot giant diamondback rattlesnake. I'm going to be handling multiple timber rattlesnakes. And by far the most dangerous thing I will have done today is driven here to see you.
Yeah.
So it's like a horrific thing that scares people. I'm kind of going on a tangent or a soapbox, and I apologize.
I'm on the exact same page.
I would encourage people to figure out what to do when the snakes are in your home. What's the best way for you to deal with that? Because there are avenues out there. And then I would encourage people to leave the snakes alone when you're in their home.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, that's, what you said that snakes have cultural value and wildlife value. I think what my dad captured years ago, when I was just a boy in the 80s, was that seeing a rattlesnake means it was a good day. Go into a wild place, and it would have been classified with seeing a bear, or finding a big shed horn in the mountains, or seeing a rattlesnake, or seeing a hornet's nest. I'm thinking of the things as a kid that would just have made something exciting, and a rattlesnake would have probably been at the top of that list.
Yeah, they're a special animal. He sounds like a smart, great man. So, it's when I moved here. I'd lived in the Rockies, and I'd lived very close to grizzly bear country and mountain lions and wolves and a lot of these big predators. And we had rattlesnakes, obviously, and I knew it was a wild place. Yeah. And I kind of like that idea. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to get attacked by a grizzly bear, but I like that concept. When you're out in the woods, there are things in nature that can hurt you. There are predatory animals. And when I moved here, it seemed like somewhat of a benign landscape to some degree, but it made me feel really good that we did still have some animals like bears and like rattlesnakes.
Something dangerous.
Yeah, they're out there.
Some mystery.
Yeah, I do not want to get bit by a rattlesnake. I don't want my friends' family. I don't want anybody to get bit by a rattlesnake. But they're an important component out there, and if you're smart in snake country, your chances are incredibly low.
In all the tromping around that I've done, which, my upbringing would have been similar to so many people that just spent their whole lives beating around in places that their moms probably told them not to go. One time, and I have gone out of my way to intentionally catch snakes more in my younger years than now. Only one time have I been struck at and actually hit by a venomous snake. Now, I've been bit by lots of non-poisonous, but it was because I was messing with them. But one time on total accident, I stepped on about a 14-inch copperhead in October, mid-October, which usually it's cold enough that they're not out that much.
Yep.
And stepped on him just like mid-body. And, it may have been more if it wasn't a big snake. Anyway, I just remember just looking down about the time I stepped on him, and he just reached around and just tapped my boot. And I was wearing a big pair of rubber boots. There was no way that it was going to penetrate that.
Yeah.
But it was kind of a marker in my mind that of all these years, that's the one time.
All that time you spent in
If
the
I'd
woods.
have been barefoot, I'd have been in trouble.
Yep.
But how often am I barefoot in the woods? Never.
Yep.
So, a lot of exposure. Have you ever been totally on accident bit by a snake?
So I first of all, I've never been envenomated by a venomous snake, and I've literally, no exaggeration, I've probably had 10,000 handling experiences, and I spend an incredible amount of time in the woods, like you, both hunting, fishing, hiking, recreating, as well as for work. Over the years, I've spent a lot of time out looking for snakes. I've never been envenomated. The closest, I'll tell you, by far the most dangerous thing that you can do with a rattlesnake is try to handle it. And I don't care if you're trying to catch it and bring it to show somebody, if you're trying to kill it, and to do that, you're getting real close. It's when you engage the rattlesnake in one way or another, that's when things get dangerous for you. So I've handled, as I mentioned, probably had 10,000-ish handling events. And I will say, I won't go through all the stories, but I've probably had 4 or 5 very close encounters while handling a snake, but still never was bit. I was struck by a timber rattlesnake a few years ago now. I was back in a real remote area, the southern Nantahala wilderness, and I was doing rattlesnake surveys in the summer, looking for these gestation sites where the females give birth. And anyways, but I had finished the survey and I was on a mission. I had miles to get out of there. And so I was just hiking, and I'd come up to a giant old growth tree that had died and fallen over. And so there was only 2 or 3 feet of room underneath it. And so to stay on the trail, and I didn't want to change my pace. I'm going to like run through the woods. So I'm walking. And so I just quickly drop down my hands and knees and kind of do like a bear shuffle under it real quick and stand up. And there were a bunch of chestnut oak saplings covering the trail on the other side of it. And my first step, once I got my hands off the ground, my first step was right on a very large 4-foot-ish timber rattlesnake. And I felt something squishy, and I looked down and I hear the rattle, and then I launch in the air, and that snake at the same time turns and strikes me in the shin. And I got away from the snake, and luckily I was wearing snake gaiters. Yeah,
because you were on a snake hunt.
And I often wear them hunting, especially turkey season. There's certain times I wear them, certain times I don't.
Yeah.
But I wear these real lightweight, they're called turtle skin snake gaiters. I bring them all over the world. I'll roll them up and bring them to the Amazon, or I'll fly into the Frank Church in Idaho with them, and they're just real convenient. They work well. I have the proof. I've got the photos where you can see on my leg, you can see the twin venom marks and the drops coming down it, that we took that picture right after it. So that was lucky. That would have been life-threatening because I was miles from the truck.
Well, so that brings up, I've got two questions. I want to talk about rattlesnake populations. I want to tell you this before I forget it. And I also want to talk about what snake venom does to you. Like how, like would you have died back there if you were 4 miles from the truck and by yourself and got bit in a pretty vital spot?
Yep.
So those 2 questions, you can answer the venomous part first. Like, well, first of all, let me say this. My anecdotal understanding of like a copperhead, like I've always felt like if I get bit by a copperhead, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. I mean, just not that big of a deal.
Yep.
I've even heard of people not going to the hospital when they got bit by a copperhead, which is probably extreme. But you hear that rattlesnake venom is more potent than copperhead venom. Is that true?
So if you're comparing a timber rattlesnake and a copperhead, yes, that is true. So the first thing I'll tell you is that with snake bites in the United States, that 25 to 50% of snake bites, the snakes don't actually inject venom. We call them dry bites. So snakes, first thing I'll tell you about venom is snakes have venom for a reason. Snakes did not evolve venom to kill people.
So not every time they strike is venom coming out those things.
They can control the delivery of venom to some degree.
Okay.
And again, they need it for other things. They use it for feeding and
killing stuff they're going to eat.
It kills things. It allows them to not have to wrestle with their prey. They inject venom. They're only in touch with it for a split second, and then that prey runs off and dies. And the interesting thing, what I find very interesting, is that then the snake goes and has to find that prey, which could be very difficult.
It's like bow hunting.
Yeah, and
shoot it and it runs off, and you got to find it.
So, and the snakes are following a scent trail. But they're not they're not following the mammal's scent trail because there's mammal trails everywhere. This has been done in the lab many times. They are actually tracking the scent of their own venom to find that prey item.
That's incredible.
And then most venoms have the characteristics, and we'll talk about some different species here in a minute, but most venoms in this part of the world have some characteristics of like digestive enzymes. And so it's digesting the prey from the inside out while the snake is digesting it from the outside in. So it allows them to eat bigger prey items that would normally take a lot longer to digest. So they need the venomous point. And 25 to 50% of bites on humans are dry bites. So you start with that.
So you get bit by a poisonous snake and it not
a venomous snake, yeah.
I did it. I said it.
No, I'm just kidding.
Get bit by a venomous snake and you don't have that much trouble and you think you're like superhuman because it didn't hurt you that bad, but it was a dry bite.
Yes.
Does that happen?
I don't know about someone feeling superhuman, but
I would. If I was out hunting and got bit by a snake and I was like, don't worry about it. I'd feel pretty cool.
But the other thing I'd tell you about venoms before we talk about, like, say, a copperhead and a timber rattlesnake is that they vary really incredibly. So they're these diverse cocktails, and they're, different species can have very, very different venoms that impact the body in different ways. And even within a species, the timber rattlesnake's a good example. You can go to different parts of the species range, and the venom has different properties, would be more, say, toxic in some cases and others. For example, there's a part of the range, kind of in like southwest Georgia and Florida, Alabama, where, if I remember correctly, that they have a lot of very kind of neurotoxic, which means it affects your nervous system. So a lot of snakes, especially coral snakes are one, but then a lot of snakes in other parts of the world have these neurotoxins, which can be very deadly because they do things like your body can't tell your heart to beat or your lungs your diaphragm to fill your lungs. So, but in general, this is a gross generalization, but most rattlesnakes, not all, some have more neurotoxic components or cytotoxins, but most of the venoms are kind of like digestive enzymes in North America, but they vary in toxicity. So you're right, a copperhead is a very minor bite as compared to a timber rattlesnake.
It's because of the venom, not because of the size of the animal. Because that's what I've thought too, is a rattlesnake just injecting more venom than a copperhead because it's bigger?
So drop for drop, the rattlesnake venom would be more toxic than a copperhead.
That answers my question.
Most rattlesnakes would be bigger than most copperheads, so actually physically have more venom as well. Okay,
so you're back in the mountains. In this part of the world, it's hard to get 4 or 5 miles from the road, 2 miles from the road. 30, 40-minute tough walk. You get bit by a rattlesnake. How long you're not going to die from that.
You might.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
You could?
Yeah, you might. So first of all, let's rule out anything that would be very rare, like an allergy or something. Like if you had an allergy to something and you go into anaphylactic shock, you die right away. Typically, people actually had more allergies to the old antivenoms and would die from that. The new ones are better. But anyway, so if you rule that out, just a rattlesnake bite in a very remote area, a timber rattlesnake bite, say in these mountains, yes, could be very, very serious and could be life-threatening.
Would it depend on where it hit you?
Certainly. So I can't answer that question perfectly because there's so many variables. Where did it get you? Did it inject venom right into like an artery or a vein? Yeah. Did it go right into a muscle? Was it on your hand? Was it on your face? How much venom did it inject?
There's a lot of variables.
There's a lot of variables. But the one thing I can tell you is that even with a timber rattlesnake, if you get to the hospital, your chances of dying are low. But a timber rattlesnake is a life-threatening bite, potentially life-threatening.
That's good for me to hear because
a copperhead I would recommend anybody go to the hospital, but I would recommend anybody go to the hospital. But it's not as life-threatening. I don't know, for example, in Georgia, where we have a lot of copperheads, I don't know of any records of anybody ever dying from a copperhead. And somebody might correct me on that, but it's not common. Whereas timber rattlesnakes, there are multiple. There's one in my county a few years ago.
Yeah.
So there are timber rattlesnakes.
Really, somebody died from a rattlesnake in your county?
Oh, yeah.
Is that right? Mm-hmm. That's surprising to me.
Yeah, people die every year in the United States from rattlesnake bites.
Now, why would we don't have to go too deep into this, but it seems to me like a rattlesnake, he's trying to kill critters maybe as big as a rabbit to eat.
Yeah.
Why would he need venom that would kill a 200-pound man?
That's a good question, and I don't think I can answer exactly, but
it's like he's shooting a .338 on a squirrel hunt.
Yeah, this would be that's a good analogy, but this would be complete speculation. But again, to me, it probably would get down to those feeding functions, meaning whatever they're eating, they want to die relatively quickly because then they have a greater chance of finding it. Also, there's a greater venom signature.
Exact same thing if you shot a .338 on a squirrel hunt. You just want it to die quick.
Yeah, and then also, the more of that venom that is in that animal's body, the quicker it's going to digest. So you could, in theory, eat bigger meals. Okay,
so that venom is working from the inside out. Yep. Digesting that, just turning its insides into mush.
Yeah, but that's speculation. I can't speak to the evolution of that. But in general, I will say snakes in North America, their venoms are for feeding. They're not for defense. But we do have, for example, if you take have you heard of Gila monsters in the Southwest, these lizards, these venomous lizards, that's a defensive venom. Okay. I have one of these in my office, and it's funny. People say
got a Gila monster in your office.
That people say that you're not going to die from a Gila monster bite unless you happen to have a gun nearby, because it's a defensive venom. Meaning as they get it into you, they don't have fangs, but as they chew on you and it kind of comes out of their gums. But as they get it into you, it's immediate, extreme pain because it's functioning in defense. That animal wants to survive. Quick. It's got to work quick. It wants that predator to be like, oh my God, this is not a good thing to eat. Yeah. But most snake venoms in North America are for feeding.
Man, that makes a ton of sense.
And your first question, you had the venom question. I can't remember your first
the second thing, and we can kind of end on this. So when I'm hunting out in the mountains, first of all, the question is about how many rattlesnakes are on the side of the mountain. But let me tell you this first. One of the regions that I hunt is very rocky, very rocky. There's old remnants of when the Ouachita Mountains were super high and there were avalanches, and we have these things they call rock glaciers, which you'll be totally forested, but you'll come into a big opening that is nothing but boulders half the size of your car, no trees, and it's remnants of avalanche chutes when the mountains were way taller. Okay, so just rock piles, no trees. One time we were actually baiting bears in a place that we had to backpack in bear bait, and just so happened we couldn't get there during the daytime, so we had to hike back in there at night. And me and my old buddy James Lawrence, it was a long walk back in there, hiked in, and we had to cross 2 rock glaciers to get to this real secluded bear bait on private land. It was a piece of landlocked private land. And man, we don't see a lot of rattlesnakes. I mean, you just don't see them. Even though I think we're in really good rattlesnake country, you don't see them a lot. Buddy, we saw rattlesnakes at night on those rock glaciers, multiple snakes. Yep. And the way we thought about it was we had just taken a straight line, probably 3/4 of a mile through the woods with what our headlights could shine on the ground. And we saw 2 rattlesnakes, which was a big deal. I mean, we see 2 rattlesnakes a year. Yeah. And so on this walk in, we saw 2 rattlesnakes, and they were up on top of these rocks, just doing their thing. So our question was, well, how many rattlesnakes are there? And we started doing the math, So if we walked 3/4 of a mile and could see 10 feet, and there were 2 rattlesnakes, so that times 500 for the side of that mountain. Does that mean there's 1,000 rattlesnakes between here and there?
Probably not. So I would say, like everything that's very complex, I'm not going to be able to answer it exactly.
Right.
But let me start out kind of in, the Blue Ridge here, which is probably somewhat similar to the Ozarks and the Ouachitas. So how do you pronounce it? Am I pronouncing it?
You did it awesome.
Ouachitas. Okay.
Ouachitas. Not like that other guy, that Steve Ranella guy.
Okay.
Who calls it the Ouachitas.
So first of all, where I live, and I'm guessing it's probably similar where you live, but I might be wrong, is that copperheads are common. So copperheads are one of the most common snakes where I live, and I'm assuming they're fairly common where you live. So that's the most commonly encountered venomous snake where I live, and in many places where both timber rattlesnakes and copperheads live. With both of them, but in particular with timber rattlesnakes, there's as we talked about with other things, there's a lot of variables. So first thing I'm going to tell you is that people just see snakes and they think of them as like this like vermin. It's like they're just
vermin
this thing
mentality.
that are everywhere and they don't have a biology. Rattlesnakes have a very interesting ecology in where they are at what time of year and for what reasons. In most cases, I would expect that where you're hunting and where I live, that rattlesnakes are not as common as copperheads. There probably are places where there are, but and they're using very particular places at very particular times of the year. And I'll just generalize.
Would have to be chasing food source.
Part of the year.
And nesting.
Some of the snakes, some of the year. So I'm going to try to do this very quickly. But so these animals are what we call ectotherms, or you commonly hear the term cold-blooded. Scientists don't like the word cold-blooded. It's kind of like poisonous versus venomous, but we won't get into that
Ectotherms, I like it.
So they're ectotherms, like we're endotherms. And all that means, endo is inside. We produce our heat physiologically.
Okay.
Snakes get their heat from the outside world.
Okay.
So
seems kind of lazy.
Yeah. A lot of animals do, fish, insects. But anyway, so that means in the winter they need to go somewhere.
Right.
And typically underground, oftentimes in the types of places you're describing.
Yeah.
So, and sometimes those will be kind of communal. So you have a good number of snakes in a certain place. So if you are let me finish this, and then then they come out in the spring, depending where you are, and a group of them go out to forage. So males and non-gravid females. Females that are not going to give birth that year. Timber rattlesnakes in most places would not give birth every year. Sometimes it can be up to 4 or 5 years between pregnancies. So those animals that are going to feed, the males and the non-gravid females, they go out typically in a pretty linear, like a true migration, like a duck or an elk would make. Really? Long distance movements, relatively linear at a relatively high rate. And they go out and then they set up these...
Now, they're not staying together. They're just kind of going the same direction.
They're not going out in like a pack. No, I mean, you can find snakes together.
Is there a name for a group of snakes? Like a covey of quail?
Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. I should know the answer to it if anybody did. So I should look that. I don't know.
Because I've never heard of a group of snakes like what you're talking about.
Yeah. So these animals go out, but typically they're going in all kinds of directions, and they're finding a foraging ground. They spend most of their summer in a core feeding ground, just like a wolf would move down to a winter range and have a core feeding ground.
It would be where there was a lot of rodents or...
And at that, and then the other group are the gravid females, the ones that are going to give birth that year.
Gravid?
Gravid.
Gravid with a T?
With a D.
Gravid.
As in David.
That means ability to give birth that year?
Yeah.
Viable females for that year?
Yes. So, and they go typically a shorter distance. These other snakes can go miles to those feeding grounds. These gravid females go typically a shorter distance, and they go to very particular places. It's usually rock on rock. It's oftentimes exposed to the sun. Basically, they're going somewhere where they can keep a high body temperature day and night. They can shuttle in and out, keep a high body temperature, and then at night, that rock that they're on has a very certain geometry, and that rock is giving off heat at night, so they can also keep their body temperature high at night. And they're finishing, again, they're ectotherms, so their body temperature changes with the environment, And everything our body does changes with temperature. We just don't think about it because we're always the same temperature.
Yeah.
So, to speed up the development of a baby or to digest food or whatever it might be, you raise your body temperature if you're a snake. So these females go there. So
even in the summer when it's warm?
Even the summer when it's...
So, I mean, they need rocks to stay warm even when it's getting down to 70 degrees at night and 90 degrees during the day. I always thought the warm temperature stuff would have just been at these fringe times, like in the spring and fall. When do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, so first of all, these gravid females are maintaining relatively high body temperatures for a snake. I can't remember exact numbers off the top of my head. But certainly during the day in a warm climate, these gravid females, they're going to come out and warm up to a good temperature, but they're going to have some type of retreat.
I guess
They'll go
what
into
I'm
the
saying,
shade.
they don't have to warm up if it's 80 degrees air temperature at night. That's my question. Or do they want to be out in the sun on a 90-degree
Well, that
day?
rock's going to be giving off more heat. So, by the morning, that rock's going to be relatively cool. And if they stay under that, they're not going to warm as quickly. They can go sit out in that sun coming up, warm up, and then they can move into the shade. I mean,
okay.
I can't say
what
exactly what they do in terms of each snake might be slightly different, but what they're doing is they're thermoregulating, or they're regulating their temperature, and their goal is to stay high. And if that means sitting in the sun at a particular time, great. If that means going into shade, and then in mountainous environments, typically it's rock that gives that at night. But there are other places. You go into the coastal plain stuff, first of all, there's not a lot of rock, but oftentimes they're using stump holes in other areas, and some of it may have to do with exactly what you're saying. So,
yeah.
So anyways, and then late in the season, the birthing season and the mating season for timber rattlesnakes is actually at the same time, which seems kind of odd, but I've told you that not all
different females are being bred.
Exactly. And then they store the sperm, because if you think about it, then they're going to go back into hibernation. So they store the sperm.
Is it like delayed implantation like a bear?
So the females are developing these follicles over long periods of time, and then they store the sperm. They go into hibernation. The year that they're going to give birth, those gravid females, they call them, when they come out, they ovulate and they fertilize those follicles. So they're storing the sperm. They're developing these follicles, their zygote, the bundle of energy inside of them, and then they're fertilizing them that year they're going to give birth.
Okay.
Fascinating.
Okay.
Slightly different than bears, but...
Yeah, I mean, kind of the same idea,
similar,
and that they're bred at a certain time.
It is fascinating. So my whole point in telling you that,
we're talking about populations.
My whole point in telling you that is that they're, depending where and when you are, you have really high chances of seeing good numbers of snakes or very little chances of seeing snakes. So for example, if you are at one of these overwintering sites in the spring or fall when they're going in or coming out, they'll typically linger there for a while, for a week, 2 weeks, making sure things are right. And if you're there at the right time, you could see a lot of snakes at once. If you go out into these foraging grounds, or if you're in these migration corridors, your chances of seeing snakes are very little to none. You certainly could bump into one, but it'd be, you're walking through the woods. Yeah, there's one sitting near a tree foraging. If you go to these gestation rocks, and I should also say that all snakes, usually at least once a year, also go to similar rocks to shed their skin. If you're at these places, you also stand a high chance of seeing a good number of snakes. And then you broaden your scale a little bit, and there are certainly places where there are good rattlesnake populations and places where there are not. So this particular ridge you were on might be a relatively robust rattlesnake population. And so those might have been foraging snakes, or you might have been relatively close to one of these breeding
so
and
it's
shedding
kind of
grounds.
like the fishing analogy of 90% of the fish may live in 10% of the water, something like that. There's not a, so it would be false to think like what we were doing.
Yeah, that calculation that you did is
totally wrong.
Probably completely inaccurate. We would have to be studying that population you're in to understand what those snakes you saw were doing. Right. But in general, I can tell you there are probably less rattlesnakes on the landscape than most people with a fear of rattlesnakes would envision. But I'll also tell you that most of us who spend any time in the woods have probably walked by many rattlesnakes that we never knew were there. Yeah. Some of the pictures of them are amazing. So I've done a lot of radio telemetry studies on various species of rattlesnakes. And it is amazing when you go to find them. I mean, I can know. I've had transmitters in a snake, and I'm standing here with technicians, but I have a technician standing where you are, maybe a little bit further away. And for the listeners, that's, let's say
4 feet.
Yeah, we're 4 feet, but say 5 to 10 feet.
Okay.
In between us, there's a little shrub. We're looking for this snake. We know it's in this shrub. And sometimes they're hidden and you can barely see them. I've had snakes multiple times. They're literally sprawled out, and all of a sudden they just like appear to you. And I'm looking for a snake in like a 5-foot square area, and it's literally laying out in the middle of it, and I can't see it. And I look at snakes almost every day. It's amazing. So my point is that they have incredible camouflage. They hide quite a bit. So most of the snakes in the landscape we don't see. They really don't want anything to do with us. So unless we start messing with them, they're typically not going to start rattling.
This is all just fascinating to me. Last question, and then we got to close. Age of rattlesnakes. How long can they live?
Rattlesnakes, timber rattlesnakes, probably most rattlesnakes will live longer than most people would think. So their strategy, I've already told you, they don't give birth every year. They are a really what I would call a long-lived capital breeder. So a female rattlesnake needs to live her whole life, which we now know of timber rattlesnakes in the wild that are over 50 years old.
Okay. Wow.
And she needs to live her whole life to potentially just give birth once, twice, 3 times, depending on the situation, because it can take her 10 years to reach sexual maturity, depending where she is, say maybe up to 5 years in between pregnancies. And it's fascinating. So animals like that have that type of biology, they have evolved where they need to live a long time to achieve their fitness. I heard you mention this on a podcast the other day. You essentially said what all animals and what humans are trying to do.
Biological success.
Yeah, that's another thing, for fitness. We're all trying to produce offspring that in turn will also pass on their genetics. And so to achieve that, a timber rattlesnake needs to live a very long life. So they're not adapted to dying. Once they're adults, they die as babies. But once they're adults, they're not adapted. So anything that kills them in between, a road, a shovel, a shotgun, a raptor, that is not natural. They should have very, very high survival. And so when you start killing adult rattlesnakes, their populations can decline very quickly. So with rattlesnakes in particular,
very few of them make it to that kind of maturity. So I remember the K-adapted and R-adapted type species. K-adapted would be a species that has a ton of offspring, but very few of them survive. Is that right?
It's the opposite. But yeah.
Okay, R-adapted. Yeah. So they would produce tons of baby rattlesnakes. Very few of them would survive to be 25 years old.
I guess a rattlesnake would be... So a rattlesnake, they would reproduce relatively few times in their lives. They have relatively few offspring. Let's say
do they?
5, 8, 10.
Okay, see, I was thinking they had 100.
No. There are some snakes, like some of your pythons and stuff that do.
Okay.
And then those babies have low survival, but after 4 or 5 years, their survival is much higher.
Yeah.
And then
just
as
not
adults,
that much stuff that's catching them.
They don't die. But if they don't live, I don't know the exact number, but if they don't live, we know they live over 50. So if they don't live a long life, their chances of replacing themselves in the wild very low. So animals like that, they're not going to decline overnight. They're not the best indicator, like we talk about amphibians are, certain lizards. Their populations aren't going to decline overnight, but if you start killing the adults, there's going to be very little kind of reproductive success in their populations decline quickly. And a lot of people gets back to a lot of the core of what we're talking about. A lot of people may take that as, oh, good, I can kill all the rattlesnakes. But from my perspective, that's a reason not to kill the rattlesnakes because we want them as a component.
Well, 10 years from now, when that female is supposed to be giving birth, she's not because you killed her.
Yeah.
You're not going to feel that until your kids are 20 years old and there's no rattlesnakes on the mountain.
Exactly. And then her babies don't get born, but even those babies would have taken 10 years. And so the rattlesnakes play the long game, if you will, whereas mice play the short game. You kill every mouse in your cabin, they're going to be mice when you get back to it next time.
Yeah.
You kill the one adult rattlesnake, over time.
It's funny. There's a lot of similarities between the strategies of a bear and a timber rattlesnake. They live in the same places. You think about it. A bear sleeps during the winter, makes a living for 8 or 9 months a year. He has the delayed implantation. I mean, a rattlesnake's doing the same thing.
Yeah. They're both great animals.
Yeah.
Great
Man,
symbols.
hey, this has been fascinating. Really has, man. Thanks a ton for meeting me over here.
No problem.
It'd only been better if you'd have brought a rattlesnake.
I would have, and I would encourage you to come to my office and bring some of your youngins here, and I'll put a rattlesnake in a safe manner in their hands.
Yes, man. Hey, don't tempt us. We'll do it.
Yeah,
we'll do it. Well, where can people find you?
Yeah, so I'm on all the social media platforms, Instagram and Facebook, and you can look me up there, Christopher Jenkins. And Instagram, I'm Dr. DRCL Jenkins.
Okay.
And then, but the place I would encourage everybody to go is what's really the important part, and that's the Orianne Society's website, and that's more about the animals. You don't want to hear much about me. So check out the Orianne Society website, which is at orianne.org, which is ORIANNE.org. And I just wanted to thank you. It's been great to meet you in person. We've talked, or at least corresponded quite a bit, and I'd just like to leave everybody with that concept. When you go out into these wild places where the bears live, the rattlesnakes live there too, and they belong there. Give them a break when you're out in those types of places.
Yeah. Right.
So thank you, Cliff.
Well, keep the wild places wild, because that's where the rattlesnakes live and the bears. You almost said the tagline of the podcast on your own without any instruction there. But, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
As you know, the Meat Eater Live Tour is on April 23rd through May 5th. Chances are in a town near you. What you may not know is you can win tickets to each of these events just by going to a backcountry hunters and anglers pint night. There's going to be a pint night in each of these towns: San Diego, Salt Lake City, Tempe, Anaheim, Boise, Sacramento, Missoula, Portland, Tacoma, where you can compete in Meat Eater trivia and win not only tickets to the show, but a chance to be on stage with all of us. So get your butt to a pint night, and we'll see you on stage.